It's time to get back into my personal blog playlist here, as it's been a while since I've made a personal blog here, but it's, had a lot more sports content past few weeks, less than 107 Grey Cup here. But here we are, personal blog number 55 here, as I'm going to continue on doing my gaming memories playlist series, I guess you can call it, within my personal vlogs here. As back in the last personal vlog, number 54, I was giving my gaming memories of the system I'm most nostalgic for, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. And believe it or not, I didn't actually mention all the titles, and I do intend to eventually make a overall whatever I missed video after I cover all the systems here. But after the Nintendo Entertainment System, I did move up to the 16-bit era, and ultimately I decided to get a Sega Genesis over the Super Nintendo after I sold my NES and games to childhood friend that lived within the neighborhood. And I decided to get a Sega Genesis here, and maybe you could say it was the brilliant marketing, because I remember it was, you could see it on YouTube, it was a commercial talking about blast processing, and they showed a race car, like a high-speed race duel there, and an old crappy van there, and an old crappy TV, and they were saying that Sega Genesis had blast processing. Well, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System did not. So you can, see that commercial on YouTube here. But I decided, I don't know if you could say I fell for that marketing campaign, but I decided to get the Sega Genesis, as I had some exposure to sampling it, and I also had some cousins that had the Master System and some games there. So I decided to go get a Sega Genesis, and obviously, ultimately, when I bought the Sega Genesis, it was the one bundled with, Sonic the Hedgehog, and it was definitely, that was definitely the big memory I first had with the Sega Genesis in the early 1990s, was Sonic the Hedgehog here, and definitely was the competitor at that time to Super Mario here. Except, you had a Speedy Hedgehog that collected rings, and that's what kept him alive, is make sure you at least had one ring there. And it was actually, at the time, he was called Dr. Robotnik. Now he's called Eggman. But he actually did start off as Dr. Robotnik, who actually, that was Sonic going after him and getting the Chaos Emeralds. And that was definitely a great way to start me off in the Sega Genesis. There was the original Sonic the Hedgehog. And also I remember, I think it was my mother actually picking up, this is back when you actually went to a place called a video store. Either it was Blockbuster or Update Video, or just your video headquarters, or any mom and pop video stores. Well, I remember she picked up a couple rentals. One actually, and it was a hot title at the time, was Mortal Kombat, and she definitely beat a kid to it. And it was definitely it was a whole new genre at that time, and it took me some time to embrace the Mortal Kombat games, believe it or not. But I remember I also had a turbo controller, and I remember it was the first Mortal Kombat game that I was able to. I ultimately had to use the turbo controller, but I think it was actually the first villain that you beat in Mortal Kombat, Shao Kahn, and I think I was able to eventually beat. I think he was in the first Mortal Kombat game. I don't want to stir anything in the community there, but that was another title that was on the Sega Genesis there, and it was definitely stir some eyebrows, and definitely stirred the pot there when it first came out. And NHL '94, and that seems to be that's that NHL game that everyone's nostalgic for. And people say that NHL series, this is now when you get beyond the fact that it was cool to see teams and players when these games had were able to get licensing rights to actually use players and names, unlike a cheap generic game where you see the team name and colors and just numbers or just made up player names. And so yeah, and same with World Series baseball. I remember playing '94 and '95 on the Genesis, and at that time it seemed cool that the graphics were enough to you got to see the different ballparks and all the familiar sites, including the Ivy at Wrigley Field, the Green Monster, and at the time it was called the Sky Dome, and see the skyboxes when at the time the building was the eighth wonder of the world. Now it's really dated now when you think about it. But I remember that, and I also was amazed by the PGA Golf. I forget what version it was. I think it was '95, not mistaken. But I was amazed at how detailed that PGA Golf game, and they had licensee right to actually use the PGA, the Professional Golfers Association, and actually having some golfers' names in it. This was before Tiger Woods came onto the tour and took over and really dominated. But those are those sports games, and I also remember playing. I think it was FIFA '94, because at that time the World Cup of Soccer was in the United States. Not as big in the soccer, but I do casually follow the World Cup when it's on, and it was in the U.S. I remember playing that, and it was a great game. That was all the sports games, but I also came back to all the other games that I remember enjoying on the Sega Genesis. Well, obviously, I had all the Sonic games. Well, yeah, the first one. The second one definitely was a great follow-up. Definitely a great sequel where they introduced Tails, and that was also another awesome adventure. And the special stage of the half pipe there, and there was other times that Tails drove you nuts with the little fox there, and he was called Tails because he had two tails. Haha. But it was a nice sidekick there, and it definitely opened up the two-player mode to it. And obviously I had Sonic 3, and I seem to have had a lot more, let's say, satisfaction beating the second and third game in Sonic, because it seemed like the battle with, at that time, Dr. Robotnik seemed a lot more epic to get to, and I owned those games as well, and definitely expanded on the first adventure there. I should also mention that Sonic spun. That's what made it great, and there's some parts in the first game that you're able to break some walls there, but it was the spin dash that was introduced in the second game there, and it definitely built upon the first game there, and yeah, definitely very nostalgic for Sonic the Hedgehog here. And actually at one time I got to the point where I actually enjoyed Sonic the Hedgehog actually a little more than Super Mario, even though if you go back to my gaming memories when I talked about the NES, that was the first character that obviously grew up with, and then it just seemed too outrageous to be true that I also grew up in there as a sports fan, that there was a hockey player that was a generational talent named Mario Lemieux, and they called him Super Mario, and it just seemed, being a little kid, it just seemed too outrageous to be true. But getting back to the Sega Genesis there, and then I do also enjoy this adventure. It was kind of a follow-up from Sonic 3, as you got the first three games, was the Sonic and Knuckles, because it was definitely an interesting turn of events how they had Knuckles in China, who was kind of an enemy, and then suddenly kind of became an ally if you followed the Sonic the Hedgehog evolution there. And yeah, I mean, and I know that Sonic and Knuckles game, that was definitely a much more tougher challenge, and it is a tougher game than the first three. I think I was able to beat Sonic and Knuckles my younger time when I had more time to obviously play the games. If I played it now, that game definitely would kick my you know what on both sides. But it was definitely also revolutionary that they had the flip off on the top of the Sonic the Knuckles game where you can play Knuckles in 3 and 2. However, they made light of it at the fact that if you put the original Sonic the Hedgehog in the Sonic and Knuckles game, you get an interesting graphic. It just says, no way. And now you're able to, as we get further ahead, and actually, hopefully the Sega Forever, if you go on the Google Play Store, they have the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2. Hopefully they eventually make Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. But eventually you can play Knuckles in the original Sonic the Hedgehog. So, yeah, I definitely, obviously, I loved those games, is the Sonic the Hedgehog. And, you know, it's definitely a revolutionary, the cartoon was definitely not as good. And I definitely was let down from the cartoon. I did enjoy the Super Mario cartoon that they had. Actually, it was kind of a mash of 2 and 3. I know I'm not trying to cross over systems now, but now that I've made the first one, and this is the natural progression, that now I can compare it. That's what I'm going to do with these gaming videos, or gaming memories videos, and my personal vlogs here. But yeah, it was definitely a nice rivalry between, you know, Mario and Sonic. You got a plumber who collected coins and fought Koopas and Toads, Turtles, and that. And then you got Sonic, who's a very fast, energetic hedgehog and collects rings. And you just need to make sure you try to collect that one ring. And it does always suck that you have 200 rings and you get hit and then you lose them all. But I also remember, you know, cheat codes and that you can make fun of glitches, and that was all fun in those Sonic games and that. And yeah, and then the other games that I remember playing on the Sega Genesis, and there was always inevitable for competition here. Tetris definitely was anonymous with Nintendo. I did remember Columns, that gem busting game that I was going to say that, you know, that match 3 in a row, which also was kind of a spawn of you know, Dr. Mario, but I think Columns definitely expanded on that and made it fun and cool with the music and that, which almost kind of inspires other games today. You can maybe say Candy Crush, that game by King, that might have been inspired back to Columns, and Sega had a couple Columns games. I remember they had 3 games there too, so that was definitely another classic title there. And I know I briefly played some Golden Axe, and I forget the title of this game right now, but I remember it was some helicopter. It was some helicopter shooting game. I forget the name of it on the top of my head. I know now there's some Sega Genesis collection there. And I remember that game was also very tough, and for some reason, you know, when you want to, sometimes you play on the easy side to get it familiar with the game there. For some reason, I actually found that game in particular not as hard and difficult than easy. I don't know if it's just you wrapped it up a little more and then knowing you were playing harder. But I remember that game. I just forget the name of it. Maybe I'll mention that in the What I Missed video, but I'll eventually, or maybe I'll come up with it. But I remember that game, and you might picture it. It's a helicopter shooter, and then the other games that started off, the Madden. Obviously, that was the start of the Madden, and with the NFL, and they had the licensing there, and the early days in that, and those were definitely fun. I mean, I definitely follow those other sports as well. So that's the other Sega Genesis there. And then obviously there was the Streets of Rage there. I remember playing the Streets of Rage games there, and it was your classic beat 'em up, shooter, not shooter, but beat 'em up game that was fun back in the day there. So I definitely enjoyed playing Streets of Rage there, and I also there was many other titles there if I can remember. I mean, I covered all the sports ones, and also the ones that I remember owning, but I also do remember renting some games here. I know this was, I think, just an exclusive on the Sega Genesis, and I never owned this game, but I remember having fun playing it, and sometimes watching it on YouTube here. I remember it was I think it was well, I'm not too sure if it was a mouse or get the name, the actual character, but I remember the title is called Rocket Knight Adventures. That was definitely a very unique game, and definitely it was a little weird at the same time, but I never remember finishing it because it was just a rental there, and between homework, bowling, and video games, you only do so much in a weekend when you had a little more time to play these games. But I remember playing Rocky Knight Adventures for the Sega Genesis there, and and I briefly did play Golden Axe. I wasn't as good at it, but I know that was a couple rentals that I had, and that was definitely much of my Genesis memories was just the sports games, where they've evolved and actually had licensing to have the rights to use the team logos and that, and players, and in fact you can have fun and play general manager itself, and make some trades, and sometimes saying, oh, this player actually would look good in that team's uniform too, and it'd be nice if you had him. But I also do remember speaking of sports games, I also do remember the NBA Jam, and that was definitely a fun arcade kind of style that was ported over, and NBA Jam. I'm casually a basketball fan. It was kind of just an arcade version of a street 2-on-2 basketball there, and this was before actually the Raptors and the Grizzlies. There was the Vancouver Grizzlies that joined the NBA, but I always played the Chicago Bulls there. But Michael Jordan wasn't in that game. I remember Scottie Pippen on there, and the NBA Jam was definitely cool just to see. Would it be cool if the player actually spun around 20 times before dunking? And that was an arcade port, but then the NBA Jam definitely evolved in there and had a tournament edition. I think eventually there was one that I played where you had the early Raptors and Grizzlies, and they're not too sure about that, but I think there was a version on the Genesis where eventually the Raptors and Grizzlies were in the game, but that was definitely a fun basketball game, and I actually did remember. Don't remember if I actually did play an actual NBA. I think I actually did rent an NBA game one time, and it didn't seem as fun as the NBA Jam, but that definitely was awesome. And right now I'm just trying to think at the top of my head any other games that I owned and had memories of, and I'm just trying to think, was there any other games that I rented and thought, oh god, that was bad. I just remember renting there was like a 6-in-1 game for Sega Genesis, and oh wow, you get 6 games, 1 cartridge, but all 6 games were terrible, so I regretted renting that, and I didn't actually play the infamously bad Action 52, which I definitely didn't play that, but I'm going to say, based on videos I saw, the Sega Genesis version looks a little better, but still terrible. And obviously I did play some updated game shows with like Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, but I think going back to much of my Sega Genesis memories was basically a lot of Sonic the Hedgehog there, and I think I only had that for a couple of years before I upgraded to the next system here, but I'll get to that in a future video here. But this is all I can think of right now for Sega Genesis, and definitely was my next step up from the 8-bit era. I also do remember, briefly playing a couple hit movies. One was Jurassic Park, and looking back, yeah, that was a short game. And now with the advent of YouTube and emulation and that, and speed runs there, I think you can finish that game like in 5 minutes. I remember into that, and then I do remember actually, because my sister also got interested in playing Sega Genesis, and I remember this game. I remember playing The Lion King, and I definitely enjoyed playing that game, and it drove my sister crazy that I did this, but I figured it out. You purposely found a way to increase. Maybe this is kind of the anti-Zelda, where there's the 3 heart challenge. But I remember in The Lion King, maybe I found this as a loophole, but it takes a half an hour to do it. But then once you do it, it's worth it to try to finish the game and beat Jafar here. But I remember in the first level, I kept dying on purpose, and I built up my health meter. I forget what I did, but it's at the time it kind of drove my sister crazy that she almost think I was cheating. But I was preparing for the inevitable battle with Jafar there, and you do see Simba, the main character, grow up throughout the game, and eventually become an adult lion. I think that was the name of the main bad guy in Disney in the Disney movie. Because I was thinking, did I say Jafar? Because I also thought of another game, the Aladdin, which I think that was the name of the main villain in that Aladdin there. So you know what I'm trying to say here is that you eventually, in the Lion King game, you eventually build up fighting for the main battle there, and I built up my health meter, and I kept dying on purpose in the first level for that reason until I was ready, and then it's like, all right, now I'm playing for serious now. I built up my health meter, and I had fun doing that in the Lion King, and Aladdin actually was a great game. Now that all these Disney games are now coming back here, and Sega had licensing rights with Disney to actually use the music and everything from the Disney here. And I also do remember another game that I rented that was bad, but it was difficult. But it was a short game, but it had a difficult first level. Was Back to the Future Part 3 there, and it all started off that horse level. And yeah, I think some movie video game crossovers don't happen. And then, speaking of that, I remember playing some Street Fighter, which kind of take on the back from the arcade and the other system, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System there. Those are all games I was rented / owned. But I think this is all I can remember for the couple years I had the Sega Genesis there, and I almost feel inclined to end it right there. That I know actually before it ended, I remember also playing Sonic Spinball there, and I also got mastered on that game where if I had my friend over and he went first and died right away, and then I play, and then I kept playing for hours till I died. But then he also kicked my ass in his computer games, so I think it was even there. But yeah, these are all the games that come to my mind right now, and I'm sure whatever I missed, I'll eventually pick up in the overall reflections video, because I do have some actually NES titles that I didn't mention in the previous video. And I think I know the one title I didn't mention in the NES video, I believe, but I know I remember playing a couple games. I mean, it seemed to be not as good in the NES version, but I remember playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it also is the arcade port there on Genesis as well. So yeah, I think this would be many games. What are all your memories with the Sega Genesis there? Let me know, and maybe some comments might spark another game that I remember, I just don't think of as it is recording here, but this is personal blog number 55, gaming memories about the Sega Genesis here, and in the next gaming memories video, I will talk about the Super Nintendo, because I do have memories of that system. I didn't own Super Nintendo, but I definitely had enough exposure from friends over the years, and yeah, that's all I remember with the Sega Genesis there. Not as much nostalgia as the NES, but it was definitely a nice step up for the next generation console. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it was, having it just so you can play Sonic the Hedgehog, and I almost feel that was worth it there alone there. So if you enjoy everything I do on my YouTube channel, just make sure you hit like, subscribe, and follow along here. And I mostly do Calgary sports here, but this personal vlog thing is just something I could do without having notes in the script here, and just say whatever's on my mind, and talk about anything here. And I just say I had a lot more sports content, but a lot more has happened. There were a lot more game recaps, and things happened here locally with one of the Calgary sports teams, and then the Grey Cup, and that's definitely a big weekend for me. So, but yeah, it's nice to add another video to the personal vlog playlist here. So, of course, I say, if you like everything, just make sure you hit like, subscribe here, and hopefully maybe I've given you guys some gaming memories yourself. So, as I always say, I'll see you in the next video here.